Hello, it's Scott Manley here, on my way back from skiing vacation, and I wanted to think about some more help for new players at Kerbal Space Program. So I really wanted to go into design of a spacecraft which is good for the 18-ton mass limit and uses very few high-tech parts. So you can use this early on in the game to get yourself science from orbit and various other things without spending the money to upgrade the launch pad, to upgrade the vehicle assembly building or other important parts. So there's a bunch of variations on this obviously, but we're going to start with a simple manned orbiter. I have the probe bodies here, we'll show you some variants using that, but let's start with this. So we put a capsule on, we need a parachute, and immediately I'm not going to use any of the RCS systems, so right click on the capsule and remove the monopropellant from it. You don't need the extra mass, so don't carry it around. I want to do a full set of science, so I've got all the science instruments available here. This is probably not useful to you. You might not have the thermometer yet. If you do, that's great. Mystery goo containment unit, you want 2 of those, or rather you probably need 2 of those. The reason being that they add mass and they only attach on the side. You can try and attach one across the front, but I generally just do this. If you're going to transmit science back, you probably want a power system attached to this, so you can attach a communitron for transmitting. You only need to transmit one of those, or add one of those, because it is a massless part. Your mass limit down here will include massless parts such as the communitron, batteries, and solar panels and things like that. But they will not actually act on the physics of your spacecraft. So I've added in an FLT 400 fuel tank, mostly because, yes, we're going to add solar panels to this, just to show you that they're there. We're going to add the 2 hot thermometer. Again, it's a massless part, you only need 1 of those. Although the OX stat photovoltaic panels are massless, you probably want 2 of them because you might find yourself turned away from the sun and unable to get the panel exposed to the sun. Okay, so to land this thing safely, we're going to need some more parachutes. We can put 2 of these parachutes on, again, balancing out. These are 0.15 tons each, and this is 0.1 tons. And when you account for the mass of the LV909 liquid fuel engine, that will bring its descent velocity down to about 5 meters per second, which is okay for landing on Kerbin anywhere. If you're pretty bold and you think you can land it always on the land, you can replace these parachutes with a pair of landing struts, right? Oh, a pair I said. Yes, there we go. You could add 3 if you like, but adding a pair of landing struts means that they will absorb the shock, and your engine, your expensive engine, which costs $750, will not get destroyed in the impact. These are actually lighter than parachutes. However, since I'm trying to do something for everyone right now, I'll do that. Alternatively, if you're really good, you can get rid of these parachutes, forget about the landing legs, and use fuel left over to slow your descent below about 5 meters per second for impact. Anyway, with an eye to continuing this, we're now going to build a booster stage. Now the booster we're going to try and make recoverable, and so what I've come up with is an FLT 200 and 3 400s. These are your basic tanks, and we're going to add an engine which will be the LVT 30. Now the T45 is a nice engine, but it masses more, it weighs more, and it has lower thrust. So generally it's not as good an engine. The advantage this one has is that it has a gimballing, so it can control your rocket a little better in the atmosphere, or early on. However, the strength of the reaction wheels in the capsule tend to make this somewhat moot, so just go with the LVT 300, it's much more powerful, you will be happy. Now I'm going to try and recover this stage, and to do that I need to have 3 of these radial mount parachutes on this stage just below the decoupler, right? This is going to land with this in the ocean, and then we're going to recover it as quickly as possible. You want to make sure that this stack decoupler and these parachutes are in the same stage. So if you look down here, you can see that these are on the same stage by mousing over them. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, this window here is not in the standard game. This is Kerbal Engineer. It provides you all sorts of useful information, such as your thrust to mass ratio or your thrust to weight ratio, your delta V stats, your burn time, all these things. So this is lets you figure out your velocities and things like that. It's very useful, but it's not standard. It's a mod which you should download if you're wanting to look at the actual numbers behind this. Okay, so we still have mass left over. I could actually add more fuel tanks to this, but then I would need to add more parachutes, and the more things you add, the more likely it's going to get destroyed when it falls over, and these are very expensive. So at this point I cut my losses, and I'm going to add another solid rocket fuel booster below this. This is cheap, it's disposable, and we don't need to worry about losing it. So this will provide us some cheap thrust early on. It's actually lower thrust to weight ratio than the stage above it. And I actually have a tiny amount of mass left. I wonder if I can get away with a couple of Sepatrons. If you have the Sepatrons, they're actually quite useful to add to these stages. And it looks like I don't have enough for 2. How about for 1? And I know what you're thinking here. Surely that is going to make the whole thing flip over. Well, there's a trick you can do here. You can pick up the center of mass, and you can select your. Well, you can select. Wait a second. I forgot. I was going to show you the new system. You can select rotation, pick this part, and then rotate it so that it matches. Yeah, that's maybe a little too much. You hold the shift key when you're rotating to get the more accurate rotation mode, and there we go. That might work. So that will provide a little extra thrust for the first few seconds of flight, where it can actually make the most difference. We are exactly at our mass limit, and we have a fully capable spacecraft. There's a lot of other things you can do. You know, you can adjust the level of solid fuel if you ever find you're close to the. If you're ever close to a mass limit, you can always try adjusting fuel levels to get yourself exactly onto the mass limit. It can really make the difference. Anyway, we're ready to go. Let's launch. Okay, here we are ready to go with our single extra rocket here. It's not very powerful, but it'll be fun to see how straight this thing flies. So, off we go. Oh, brilliant! Look at that! Almost as if it was part of the rocket. It was designed that way. So that got us a little bit of acceleration. Early on, having more acceleration really helps because you can carry that velocity over. So make sure your thrust is maximized. Oh, also make sure your two stages are going to fire at the same time, so that the separator and the engine both trigger simultaneously. You can right click on this and wait for 0, and bingo! There's, I missed that. Okay, so we're on our way to space. We've acquired a little extra velocity. And now we can just start to time accelerate just a bit. I'm just going to use time warp to make this happen a bit faster. Now, you are going to turn over towards the right. We all know this. But we don't want to be too aggressive in it, simply because this stage needs to be lofted vertically as high as possible. It needs to be able to get onto a suborbital trajectory which will keep it high in the sky for sufficiently long that this one can get into a higher orbit and get safely in position, let's say. So I'm not wanting to go below about 45 degrees with this thing here. It's a little more squirrely simply because I'm running at double time acceleration. Time acceleration is very helpful for such things, because otherwise I would have to be making up all sorts of small talk. So I'm going to slow down to regular speed now. We're up at around 27 kilometers. We're high enough now that when we deploy this stage, the parachutes won't automatically fire, but they are triggered, so they will open when the spacecraft gets low enough. We're also above 20 kilometers and continuing to go upwards, so the spacecraft will not magically disappear when it gets beyond the 2.5 kilometer mark. There, yes. As long as it's still there, you know you're successful. But it is going to go up. And now we want to make sure that we get ourselves into orbit, or at least the better part of an ascent into orbit, let's say. You need to get above 70 kilometers before this, you know, descends down into the atmosphere. So don't flatten out your trajectory too much. You probably want to take your apoaps up to about 120 kilometers or possibly more. It's probably gonna, you know, vary from person to person or from launch to launch depending upon your exact profile. So to switch between the parts, you can't switch while you're in the map mode. You have to do the switching while you're in the space center. Here we go. I'm just gonna bring this sideways. I should flatten this thing out a whole lot more. Ah, look, we get plenty of time. We've just reached the apex, the apoaps of this suborbital trajectory. And yeah, let this get up to about... I'll let it get up to 125. It would be unfortunate if I managed to underestimate this. And 125. Okay, so now we need to go back to the Space Center to actually switch, because we haven't unlocked the necessary upgrades. I haven't unlocked anything in this Space Center. The thing I would say is most important to unlock is the Astronaut Center. Okay, so untitled spacecraft, there we go. That's the one. Fly it. And this will land conveniently in the ocean. Rather like the SpaceX spacecraft, which is attempting to do the same, although it's not going to use parachutes. Interesting story. Did you know that the original Mercury launchers, they used a redstone rocket, and they actually, in the original design, included space for parachutes to land the spacecraft, or land the booster, in the ocean. They ultimately decided it wasn't that useful because the cost of recovering and refurbishing it was, you know, not economical, let's say. And since they were rushing to get the program working as quickly as possible, it was an easy thing for them to cut out. So I'm time accelerating down. Got to remember to come out of time acceleration before I hit 500 meters or these things could shear off. And 500 meters. So now the next thing is we're going to descend towards the ocean and we're going to land softly, right? We're moving at 5.1 meters per second, but we're going to start to fall over. And by the time, if we let this whole thing fall over, then the stuff up the top will probably hit the ocean faster and get destroyed. So you want to have your mouse sitting up here waiting for the recover spacecraft button to appear. As if you catch it quickly, then you will be able to recover the whole spacecraft. If you fail, then you will lose chunks of your spacecraft and you will be sad and lose some money. This is obviously all about maximizing the amount of cash your space program has. And there we go, recovered vessel. And without further delay, we need to rush over to the tracking station and take control of Jebediah in space. He's on a suborbital trajectory and he's actually past the apoaps, so we could have put him even higher still. Start firing the engines right away. And unfortunately we are in nighttime here, so you can barely see the spacecraft. I'm firing my engines upwards a little just to try and make sure I don't descend too much. Okay, and... can we get into orbit in time? Of course we can. We get plenty of fuel on this thing. We're probably wasting just a little. If you get it exactly right, then, you know, you can end up firing your engines at apoaps and feeling all awesome. But there, look, we've got this spacecraft into orbit, and it now has all the science and everything we could ever need. So that is a solid design, and the great thing is, you can replace this spacecraft with other payloads on this rocket design. Okay, so we can repurpose this basic design for other mission requirements. This is just getting science from orbit. You don't have enough delta V to go beyond orbit with this. Now, first thing you might want to do is save this whole subassembly down here, right? Now, in the top left you have Enable Advanced Mode, and you have a sub-assemblies window. You also have like filtering and filter by manufacturing, things like that. You can build your own categories. But sub-assemblies lets you take multiple parts and reuse them as a block. So what I'm going to do is hold Alt and then left click on the stack decoupler, and I get a copy of this whole rocket here. Drop that in the sub-assembly and I can call this 18-ton booster, right? So that will be my kind of default booster for the rest of the spacecraft. The other thing I can do is just redesign the spacecraft from the ground up. So now we're going to do a rescue spacecraft. This is going to be able to fly into orbit and rescue a Kerbal that's stuck there. So to get into orbit and rescue him, it's going to have a probe body to control the spacecraft, right? But we don't need the science, so we can throw away the science. There we go, take off the thermometer. We'll definitely need the solar panels. We can throw off the communitron. And now going back to the sections here, we can add a probe body on top. And I've got the Staputnik, that's the one that you will probably unlock first, but you do also have the Probodyne Octo if you've gone a little further down the tech tree. This will land a little fast, so you might want to add landing struts. Again, just the pair. We're just wanting to cushion the impact sufficiently that we don't destroy the spacecraft and the Kerbal you've just rescued. The other thing you'll probably want to add is a pair of battery packs, or one or more battery packs, because when you're on the dark side of the planet, these solar panels will not work. So the battery packs will provide you extra battery power to continue to orbit around and maintain control. Okay, so we've got about half a ton to spare, and for this I would say add a little more fuel because you'll be maneuvering around on orbit. FLT 100 is just a little heavy. Let's ditch the Sepatron, and we're still just a tiny bit heavy. So right click on the solid rocket booster and drop that a little. There we go. In fact, unfortunately, because I don't see if there's any way to, oh yeah, it's just tiny, you know, maybe if we drag it all the way down we can get close. It wants to snap to the end, so I can get as close as I like. 17.7, that's it. I guess I could add Sepatrons until I hit my part limit or mass limit. That'll work. So that should take off just fine. Again, make sure you've got everything in the correct stages, because this has messed up my staging. This should go here, and these parachutes should go here, as should this engine. And now it tells us we've got 5.950, so that's more than enough to get into space, maneuver around a little, and of course before you launch it on a rescue mission you would want to remove the pilot. That's great! Okay, so that's our rescue spacecraft, so let's save that. Now, if we want to take the same spacecraft design and go further afield, if we want to go to the moon, we cannot have the crew capsule. It adds too much mass, and it is possible with higher technology, you know, say using turbojet engines to get a lower mass spacecraft to the moon, but we're presuming that you haven't unlocked that yet, and it's cheaper to just build a bigger rocket. But if you only want to stay below your 18-ton limit because you're trying to show off or something, yeah, you gotta ditch this command capsule. Now the only problem is you can't pull it out because it's the root part. Well, of course the new editor has a solution to it. You have the change root tool. What you do is you select an object and then you select what the new root should be, and now the Staputnik space probe is now the root object of this spacecraft. So if we want to build something to go to the moon, we actually ideally want to land on it, because the contract you get, Conquer the Moon, says head to the moon and return science from the surface of the moon. Because it's a space probe, it doesn't have any internal torque, so you need to have the small inline reaction wheel added. You need to have photovoltaic panels to make sure that you're getting a continuous source of power, and you probably need at least 2 of those. It's totally acceptable to attach these to the space probe. Similarly, adding some battery packs are nice. The radial attached battery packs are better, even though the mass of these two are identical. Or rather, you know, 2 of these mass is the same as 1 of these. These are massless. They don't actually contribute to vehicle physics, so they are much more efficient to have on spacecraft. For landing, you can have for transmitting science, you can have a communitron on top. That gets you 8.3 kilometers per second delta V. Great. So getting back from the moon probably isn't going to happen. I'm sure there's a way to get it. The margins are very, very thin when you start adding in science, which will add some of that, and some mystery goo, and of course a thermometer, so you can collect data from the surface. And that gets you up to 17.4. We have a 7 kilometer per second delta V, which is pretty easy to land on the moon with, but it's probably below what you can use to get back with. I'm gonna add 3 landing gear. That brings you down to about 6.7. And actually, let's throw this out and replace it with a slightly bigger fuel tank. So bigger fuel means more margins, means more room for error, but we do need to add back in our thermometer, and we only need 1 of those. And we're just over the limit, and we have nothing to spare, except we can spare a little bit of fuel here, right? So we can cut down on that. 6.8, definitely able to land on the moon with that, and return science. Actually, let's put the thermometer on here. That makes far more sense. Now, there's one little trick you can do here, incidentally. With the offset tool, this is quite tall and narrow, and it has to be, basically. There's no way around it. You could put these on the side. You could put 1 of each on the side, but then your delta V margin gets far too low for most people to handle. You can, of course, use the offset tool to move these things out just a touch. And that lets you, well, get a little wider base, but I think you can go even further still by moving them sideways, and then selecting the landing strut, selecting the rotation tool, and making sure that they're actually rotated outwards. So now you have a little more margin for wobble, let's say, in your spacecraft. The game treats those as part of the spacecraft. I mean, really every spacecraft in Kerbal Space Program is made up of a bunch of parts flying in close formation, constrained by the laws of physics. So as weird as this looks, it is absolutely valid. And finally, if you really want to go as far as you can ditch the landing gear, you can ditch the mystery goo, ditch all the experimental stuff, and just add more fuel tanks. I'm not sure how much you can get off of this. Let's try FLT 200. Can we fit another one of those on? We're just over the limit here. And yes, we could ditch a little bit of more fuel here to get below the limit. Or, you know, if you really want, if you don't want to bother recovering that stage, you can always strip off these parachutes. But either way, we have about 8.5 kilometers per second of delta V. You can get into the sphere of influence of any body in the Kerbal system and collect science if you have a contract for that. So anyway, I hope you've learned something. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.